In this video, we're going to make a simple Svelte app that lets you manage a list of departments. We'll show you how to display the data, search through it, plus create, edit, and delete the records. This will be a longer video for sure, as we're going to be creating a fully working app from start to finish, but I'll have it time-stamped if you want to jump around to certain parts. For this app, we'll be implementing the MVC, or Model View Controller design pattern. An MVC pattern looks something like this. You have the model, or the part that handles the data, the view, or the part the user sees and uses to manipulate the data, and a controller, which is typically a middleman that takes the user input from the view and talks to the model. Models, views, and controllers are usually separate for each type of data you have, and they usually match the tables in your database. To get started, we're using Visual Studio Code, which is free to download. I also have the SvelteKit and Tailwind plugins installed. We also need a database set up already. I'll be using a Postgres database, but any database you're comfortable with will work, of course. Here is the SQL that generates the tables I'll be using in this project. We have a data schema and a department table that just stores an ID and a name. I also have a pre-made helper function for interacting with the database. Its contents don't really matter much here. You just need to know we run a query in our database by simply using something like PostgreSQL.query and send the SQL and any parameters to it. If you're using a different database, you just call your query function in place of mine when you see it. Or this code will also be available to download in the description if you wanted to use my helper function in your PostgreSQL database. First thing we need to do is create a blank Svelte app. We'll do that using npx sv create basic app. We'll choose a minimal app. We're going to use TypeScript, and we're going to add the Tailwind CSS add-on. Then the last question, we're going to make sure to pick npm. Once that's done, it creates a new folder wherever you run the terminal called basic app. We can open up that new folder in VS Code by typing code-n period. And in that new window, we can start off by typing npm install to install our dependencies. I also need to install the PG package for PostgreSQL and the matching TypeScript support package for that as well in my example. For our MVC model, there's a basic file structure we can follow. Many people can do it differently, of course, but this has been my method for years. For our model code, I just like to put it in a server folder in the lib directory, as we'll see in a few. And each file will basically be an exportable JavaScript module that'll handle manipulating the database for each data type. The views would be the plus page Svelte files or components that display the HTML to the user. This includes the forms the user interacts with to view and edit the data. We only have the initial homepage file currently. And then the controller is a matching plus page server.ts file, or perhaps an API endpoint. It would take the data sent to it and calls the appropriate model functions. And we don't have any of those yet, but I'll show you an example of using the page server.ts file and an API endpoint by the end of the video. Let's start off by creating the model for our department table. First, create a server folder in our lib folder. Then create a department.ts file. The file name should match our data type that we're going to be manipulating. This file will contain a single exported function that has the same name as our data, department, and in that function, we're going to create other functions for manipulating departments. Again, this file will be a JavaScript module file, and modules just allow you to split up your code into separate files. Then whenever we need to do something with departments in our example, we'll just import this file. Usage of the code will eventually look something like this. Here we can just call the department module the create function and send something to it. Or another example is the delete function and send an ID to delete. Then we'll expose a single API object from this module. And in that API object, we'll have functions that interact with the database. Let's make placeholders for a generate object function and some async functions called getAll, getSingle, update, insert, and delete. At the top of the file, we're also going to define what a department object contains by using an interface. And also a definition for a validation error that we can check for if something goes wrong. Then we export those two types. In our generate object function, we'll take in a row from the database and output our database object from our interface. And we'll do that by manually mapping each property from iDepartment to a database column. And once we have everything mapped, we just return the object. And the purpose for doing this is to end up with a defined object. In this case, it'll be a department. And this will allow us to leverage the autofill that our editor can do. And it helps prevent errors, as the TypeScript checking will warn us if we're trying to do something that shouldn't be possible. A shortcut way to map the database to the object without using this function would just be to use the spread operator to convert one object into another like this. But it's not the best way for error prevention. For one thing, the database column names and property names might not match. Also, you might want to do some other data manipulation before setting it to the object. Like an example I do all the time is converting the database date format to a JavaScript date. Moving on to our getAll function. This function will simply return all departments. The return type of the function will be a promise that returns an array of iDepartments. Then let's create a variable that will store the array of departments. Then we'll just do a database query to select asterisk or all from the department table. Again, we're using my pre-made PostgreSQL helper function. And that function, the query function for that, just requires we send a SQL statement and any parameters needed for the prepared statement. And this one doesn't need any parameters. But in the end, it'll just return a response that contains all our rows, if any. Then let's loop through all the rows, and for each row, convert it to our iDepartment object using our generate object function. And then add that object to the departments array. Then we just return that array. Then for our getSingle function, we'll require a department ID as input. The return type for this function will be a promise that returns an iDepartment object or void. We'll then run a database query to get that single row by ID. Notice how we add the parameter now to our database query function. This variable we send here replaces the $1 in the query statement if you're not sure how prepared statements work. While looping through the results, we're only going to convert the result to an object and return it. And if for some reason we didn't find a row in the database, it's okay that we just return nothing. We'll check for that later. In our update function, we'll take in an entire iDepartment object. The return type of this function will be a promise that returns an iDepartment as well, or a validation error. We then need to check if everything that is required exists. And for this example, we should make sure that at the very least, the department name is not blank. And if it is, we're going to return the custom validation error object we defined in the interface on top. Then we prepare a matching SQL script that will update the desired columns. Then we just fill in our query parameters with the matching iDepartment object properties. There are many times we might need the results after a row updates or insertion, like to get the newest ID that was generated. So I always return the new record back, and PostgreSQL has a neat function where you can just add returning asterisk or returning all to the update or insert statement, and it'll actually return it when it's done as well. Once it is done, we do need to check if nothing was returned, which would mean the SQL statement failed for some reason. And if that happens, we can throw a JavaScript error, as that would be a pretty big deal. But if it was returned, we convert and return the database row like this. And we only need to worry about the first row, which is index 0. Then we do the exact same almost for the insert function. So we're going to copy it. We send an department object, set the return type to a promise with an iDepartment or a validation error, check the same requirement, and instead run a SQL insert statement. Return the result. And this one only needs one parameter for the query, as the ID is auto-generated in the database. Then finally, to delete it, we'll just take in the ID to delete. We'll say that this function returns a void promise, and we'll just run a delete statement in the database. Now let's actually use this code by creating our view and controller. In order to make the example look a little nicer, I'm going to copy the look of our page from my login videos and apply it to all pages in this app by putting the code in my layout.svelte file. In a nutshell, there will basically be a top gray bar and a centered area for the main part of the page. And here's what it looks like before we add anything extra. And this was done pretty quickly using Tailwind CSS classes. And again, you can check out the code for this in the description if you want. Back in our home page code, let's replace the default SvelteKit text with an area that will have a search box. A search button. And an add button in order to add a new department. And here's what it looks like. But I forgot to add the page background image that I wanted. So I'm going to go into our main HTML file and just add the classes for that there. Back to our main homepage. Below the buttons, we'll just list the departments. To get to the departments, we can load them all when the page first loads, or we can fetch them through an API endpoint. We'll do the page load method first in this example. So let's create a plus page.server.ts file in the same directory as the page Svelte file. And in there, we'll call the built-in load function. In that load function, we'll call our getAll function from our department module that we just created. And we're going to save the results to a variable. Then we'll just return that variable. Now back on the page, that's our view. We can access that return data by calling Svelte 5's props rune. Below our search bar, we can now loop through all the departments by looping through data.departments and adding whatever HTML we want to show it. For each department, let's also add a button next to the name that will allow us to edit the department. This button will send people to a new page in the department directory, and it'll also include the department ID in the URL here. In order for that to work, let's go to our routes folder and add that department folder. And in the new department folder, add a special folder called slug, which is wrapped in square braces like this. We'll get into this in a few minutes, but this route will take the ID you specify in the URL after department and make it available as a variable that you can read. So basically sending people to department /150 would be the same page and the same code as department /199. But first, notice here we're now duplicating our button and long class code over and over again. You want to always avoid duplicating code whenever possible. We want to do that because what if we decided in the future we want our buttons to look a little bit different? We'd have to find and change every single button code, and there's a good chance we're going to miss some. So to avoid that, let's turn this button into a Svelte 5 snippet. So if we go above our HTML and add a snippet tag like this and define it as button, and say that the input will be the parts that will change, which would be the text for the button and whatever the on-click function might be. And then we can just move our button HTML into the snippet and insert those values where appropriate. And then down below, we can just now render that snippet where we need it and provide the parameters it wants. We don't have a function for searching or adding yet, so that can just stay blank for now. And there you go. Same page, but much less code and easier to maintain in the future. This snippet can also just be a Svelte component file as well, if it's going to be reused on more than just this page, which is typically what I do in my large apps, and we probably should do here, but I wanted to show you all an example of the new snippets in Svelte 5 as well. Okay, so moving on. We don't have any departments yet. We probably should also add a check to see if there is none and display a nice message if so. Now let's go back to our add button. In that function, we can just send people to our dynamic department/slug page and provide an ID of 0. And then on that page, we'll look for the 0 ID and do an insert if it's 0 or an update if it's greater than 0. And let's work on that right now. So on our slug folder in the department folder, let's add a plus page.svelte file. In that file, we'll show an input box that lets you create or edit a department, and a button to save or cancel and go back to the list. This will look very similar to the page we just created, so let's just copy that and then do some changes. We'll also need to move our snippet over as well, which is why I'm saying we probably should have just made that a component. In order to display the current department, if it's not new, we need to fetch the info for it from our database. We could do the same load function in a page server file here, but I also want to show you an example of loading from an API endpoint, so let's do that instead. The first thing we need is a placeholder variable for the selected department. This will be one of our iDepartment objects. And then we need to give it some default values that should be set if it's a new one. Then we need to add the onMount function, because when the page is rendered, we want to call the API endpoint using the JavaScript fetch function. We don't have that endpoint created yet, but let's just set it to /API/department, and then followed by the ID of the department, which we'll be able to read from the slug like this. Then we need to have a try-catch block, because the JSON conversion might throw an error. And then we'll make the API return a department object. So we'll set that JSON response to our department variable above. Then we'll finish our catch block and alert if there's an error. Down in our department input, we can set the value of it to department.departmentName. Something special we need to add here though is the bind event to the value. This will make sure that changes to the input will flow back into the object, because we're going to use whatever the object's values are to save this later. Let's go ahead and create that API endpoint now. So we'll make an API folder in routes, then a department folder in there, and similar to before, a slug folder in here. In that slug folder, we'll create a plus server TS file, which is what you use for API endpoints. That file will have a function listening for GET requests. Here we'll grab the ID from the URL slug by accessing the parameters parameter. Then we'll get the department using our department module we created and the get single function. And we'll have to convert the slug value to a number, as that's what our function requires. If it's a new department, this variable will be void, so let's check for that and return an object with default values instead, if so. We'll then at the end return a JSON response with the full department object in it. And if you want to check out what's going on here, we can add a console log back in our HTML page and see what the JSON response actually looks like. Now to save this new department, let's update our save button functions to a new function we're going to create above. And up here, this function will take the state of the current department object, convert it to a JSON string, and send that in the body of a put request if it's existing or a post request if it's new. Now back in our server.ts API file, we need to look for post and put requests here as well. The post function, which is for new records, will just read the form input by looking at the JSON request. We then need to create a department object and map the form inputs to it. The ID can be 0 for this new one, as again the database auto assigns a new number anyways. Then we'll run our insert function from our department module, and we'll send the department object. And then we'll check to see if the response is our custom validation error, and if so, we'll return a JSON response with that error. If it's all good, we'll return a JSON response with the status being 200. Now for the responses, we really should be checking for these back in our main page, especially for an error. So here, we should look for status 200 and only show saved if so. And if it's not 200, show the message sent back. And finally, let's go back into our API code and do the put requests. It's almost identical to the post requests, so let's just copy it and change it to put. And we'll grab the department ID instead of using 0. And change the module function from insert to update. Now let's see if it works. Here you can see if we type in a new name and click save, we see the saved alert. If we click out of that, we are now taken back to the list of departments, and we can see we have something in there now. Also, we can click on edit, and we are taken to the page which has HR already filled in, and we can alter that if we want to. Now let's work on the delete button. I'm going to add the delete button to the details page next to the save and cancel buttons. And we only want this to show up for an existing record, so let's wrap the button in an if statement, looking for a 0 ID or not. And this button will call a new function that calls the delete API endpoint for the department. And also, we just need to add a delete function to our API script as well. Here we don't care about the request, but we do need the slug from the parameters. Then we just simply call our delete function from our module and provide it with that department ID. And there we go. We can delete as well now. Lastly, let's make our search box work. Let me add a few more departments really quick so we have something to actually look for. Then on our main page code where the department list is, let's add a variable that will track the search input value, and let's bind that value to the input like this. The variable is being created using the Svelte 5 state rune so that changes can be tracked. And let's also add a Svelte 5 effect rune so that if any state variables in this function change, the function will be reran. And this function will just take our list of all departments and return a new list based on if it matches the input or not. And to get this working, let's add a new state variable that will hold the filtered results and make it blank for now. Then back in our effect function, we can use the built-in JavaScript filter function to set the filtered list to be what's on the full list only if it matches the search term and if the search term isn't blank. And there you go. Now if we start typing in the search box, the record list updates instantly, and we see a message if none was found, and we can also clear the search box to see all the records again. So that's about it for this video. You can apply the same idea to add more tables or data points to your app, like a list of users or permissions, just about anything. For each of those new data points or tables, you just create another similar MVC pattern to do all the work. So you'd make a model that does all the database work for users, for example. You'd make a view for viewing and searching for users, and a controller or an API endpoint for talking to the model for users. If you have any questions, just let me know down in the comments, and thanks for checking this out.